The paper was already unfolded on the table when the little girl pulled on his sleeve and said, "Don't let them make you sign that, Mr. Harlan." Nobody heard her. Or maybe they did and just decided she wasn't worth the interruption. Lawrence Harlan had spent 41 years building a name that meant something in this city. He'd started with a single storefront on Clement Avenue, a small insurance office. His father had left him with 3 filing cabinets, a leaking roof, and more debt than inventory. He'd turned it into Harlan Financial Group, a mid-sized wealth management firm with offices in 4 states and a client list that included 2 sitting senators. He was 63 years old. He had bad knees and a good reputation, and he trusted the people around him the way a man trusts the floor beneath his feet, without thinking about it, because it had never given way before. That's Tuesday afternoon in September. Lawrence sat at the head of the conference table in his own building, in the corner office on the 14th floor with the view of the harbor he'd always loved, and he was surrounded by people who had known him for years. His son-in-law, Derek Paulson, sat to his left with a yellow legal pad and a pressed shirt. His longtime business attorney, Martin Greer, had flown in from Atlanta that morning. His CFO, Sandra Cho, had a stack of documents tabbed with colored flags. His daughter, Patricia Paulson, née Harlan, sat across from him with her hands folded and her eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance, the way she'd been sitting since she walked in. And then there was the little girl. Nadia was 8 years old. She was Derek's niece, the daughter of his younger sister, who had dropped her off that morning because there'd been some mix-up with school schedules. No one had been particularly happy about it. Martin Greer had raised an eyebrow. Sandra Cho had asked once whether they'd like to reschedule. Derek had said no. This would only take an hour. Nadia could sit in the corner and read. Nadia was not reading. She had been watching the room since they arrived, not fidgeting, not asking for anything, not doing what children usually do when they're dragged somewhere boring and adult. She was watching the way a child watches when something doesn't feel right, and she doesn't yet have the words for why. The document on the table was a restructuring agreement. Lawrence had been reviewing it in pieces for 6 weeks, a plan to consolidate Harlan Financial Group's 4 regional offices under a new holding structure, with Derek named as executive director and Lawrence transitioning to a chairman emeritus role. Semi-retirement, his own idea more or less. He was tired. His knees ached. Patricia had been asking him for 2 years to slow down, and he'd finally agreed that maybe 63 was old enough. Martin had drawn it up. Sandra had reviewed the numbers. Derek had added a few provisions that Lawrence hadn't had time to read as carefully as he should have. "We're ready whenever you are," Martin said, sliding a pen across the table. Lawrence reached for it. "Don't let them make you sign that, Mr. Harlan." Everyone turned. Nadia was standing up from her chair in the corner. She was holding her book against her chest, a battered paperback about horses, and she was looking directly at Lawrence with an expression that was too steady for a child her age. Derek laughed first. It was a short, controlled laugh, the kind that's meant to dismiss something before it can take hold. "Nadia, sweetheart, sit back down." "I heard what Uncle Derek and the man were talking about in the car," she said. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. "Kids hear things," Derek said, still smiling, but the smile had changed shape. "She's been in the back seat all morning. She's probably mixing things up." "What did you hear?" Lawrence asked. Martin Greer set his pen down. "On the way here," Nadia said. "Uncle Derek was on the phone. He didn't know I was awake," he said. She paused, pressing the book harder against her chest. "He said the old man was finally going to sign, and once it was done, the old man wouldn't be able to undo it without a court fight, and court fights take money, and he was going to make sure there wasn't any money left for that." The harbor sat blue and indifferent outside the window. Nobody spoke. Patricia had gone very still across the table, not surprised still, something else. The kind of stillness that comes before a person decides how to arrange their face. "That is," Martin started. "Completely taken out of context," Derek said. His voice was calm. "Impressive, really. I was talking about a different client. I have other clients, Lawrence." "Nadia, I don't know what you think you heard, but you've got it mixed up with something else. This is adult business, and you don't understand what any of it means." "You said the old man," Nadia said. "You always call Mr. Harlan that." "I've heard you say it before. I call a lot of people. You said it last Thanksgiving, too. When you and Patricia were arguing in the kitchen. You said the old man was slowing everything down and you were tired of waiting." Patricia turned her face away from the table. Lawrence looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he looked at Derek. Then he looked at the document in front of him, the one he'd been about to sign. And he picked it up and held it the way you hold something when you're reading it for the first time instead of the 5th, when you're actually looking instead of confirming. "Martin," Lawrence said, "walk me through Section 7 again." Martin Greer, who had been Lawrence's attorney for 19 years, took a breath. Lawrence, Section 7, Martin. The silence that followed was the kind that tells you everything. Martin Greer had drafted Section 7. Martin Greer, who had flown in from Atlanta that morning on what he said was a routine trip. Section 7 contained a provision that Lawrence had skimmed and told himself he'd understood. A clause about financial oversight during the transition period that, when read carefully, gave Derek Paulson sole discretionary authority over the firm's liquid assets for a period of up to 18 months. No board review required, no shareholder notification. 18 months in which Derek could move money, restructure debt, redirect cash flow, and Lawrence, as chairman emeritus, would have no operational authority to stop any of it. It was elegant, if you wanted to call it that. The kind of thing that looks routine in a restructuring document until you realize what it actually says. Lawrence read it twice. Then he set the document down on the table and put the pen down beside it. "I'm not signing this today," he said. "Lawrence." Martin's voice was careful. "I understand there are concerns, but I think if we just—" "I said I'm not signing it." Derek was already shifting in his chair, already recalibrating. "This is because of what an 8-year-old said?" "Lawrence, she's a child. She doesn't understand what she heard. You're going to let a kid derail 6 weeks of planning over some misconversation from the back seat of a car? I'm going to have my own attorney review Section 7. Lawrence said. "Not you, Martin. Someone I retain independently. That's what I'm going to do." "You're being careful," Lawrence said. "I'm being careful. I'm allowed to be careful." He stood up, 63 years old, bad knees. And he stood up in his own conference room, in his own building, and looked at the people who had been sitting at his table and understood, maybe for the first time in a long time, that a room full of people who know you is not the same thing as a room full of people you can trust. He looked at Patricia last. She was still not looking at him. "Patricia," he said. She looked up. Her eyes were red at the edges, but not from crying. From something else. From the particular misery of a person who made a choice they can't unmake sitting in a room where that choice is being discovered. "Did you know?" he asked. The question sat between them for what felt like a very long time. "Not all of it," she said finally. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Not Section 7. I didn't know about Section 7, but some of it." She didn't answer, which was its own answer. Lawrence nodded slowly. He looked down at the harbor. He had always loved that view. The water moving, the light on it, the sense of distance it gave him from whatever problem was on his desk. He'd chosen this office partly for that reason. He had been, for most of his life, a man who believed in looking at things honestly. "Everyone please leave," he said. "Except Nadia." There was shuffling. Martin Greer picked up his briefcase with the speed that suggested he understood the meeting was over in more ways than one. Sandra Cho gathered her flagged documents without a word. Derek stood, and for a moment he seemed like he might say something more, might try to salvage something, but he looked at Lawrence's face and seemed to decide against it. Patricia paused at the door. "Dad, please," Lawrence said. "Not right now." She left. The office was quiet. The harbor moved outside the window. Nadia was still standing by her chair in the corner, holding her book, looking at Lawrence with that expression that was too steady for a child of 8. Lawrence walked over and sat down in the chair next to her, not the conference chair, one of the smaller ones along the wall, and he looked at her for a moment. "How old are you?" he asked. 8.5, she said. "You're very observant for 8.5. My mom says I notice things other people don't. Your mom is right." He paused. "Were you scared? To say something?" Nadia thought about it. "A little. Uncle Derek gets mad when I talk during adult things, but you said something anyway." "You were about to sign it," she said simply, like that explained everything. Like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "You were about to make a mistake, so I said something." The end. Lawrence Harlan sat with that for a moment. 41 years in business, 19 years with the same attorney, 22 years watching his daughter build a life with a man he'd welcomed into the family without looking as closely as he should have. 41 years of trusting the floor beneath his feet. He thought about all the times someone smaller or quieter or less positioned than him might have tried to get his attention and he hadn't noticed. He thought about how many times the floor had felt solid and he'd just assumed it was. "Thank you," he said. Nadia shrugged with one shoulder. "Okay, I mean it. I know," she said. "You're welcome, Mr. Harlan." He almost smiled. "You can call me Lawrence." She considered this seriously. "I think I'll keep calling you Mr. Harlan," she said. "It seems more appropriate." And that did make him smile, a real one, the first one in what felt like hours. In the weeks that followed, Lawrence did exactly what he said he would do. He retained a new attorney, a woman named Colette Osei, who came recommended by a colleague in Boston, and who had no prior relationship with Derek, Martin, or anyone else connected to Harlan Financial Group. He handed her the restructuring document and asked her to read it the way a prosecutor reads a contract. She called him 4 days later. "Section 7 is bad," she said, "but Section 12 is worse. Did you read the indemnification clause?" He had not read the indemnification clause. Section 12, as Colette explained it, contained language that would have effectively shielded Derek Paul from personal liability for any financial decisions made during the 18-month oversight period, even in cases of gross negligence. Paired with Section 7, it was a package. Derek could move money however he chose, and Lawrence would have had no legal recourse to recover losses attributed to decisions Derek made within the scope of his authority. "How much exposure are we talking about?" Lawrence asked. "Depending on how aggressive he wanted to be?" Colette paused. "Most of it." Lawrence sat with that for a long time after he hung up the phone. He sat in his office and looked at the harbor and thought about the fact that he had been 6 inches from a pen when Nadia had pulled his sleeve. 6 inches. The investigation that followed was not fast or clean or simple, the way these things never are. Colette filed a complaint with the state bar regarding Martin Greer's conduct. A conflict of interest at minimum, something more serious if the documentation bore out what they suspected. Martin's license was suspended pending review before the year was out. Derek retained his own attorneys, expensive ones, and spent 3 months insisting that the document had been standard and the child had misrepresented a private business call. Nadia was not asked to testify. She was 8 years old and it was not that kind of proceeding. But Lawrence made sure through Colette that her account was part of the record. Exactly what she'd heard, exactly what she'd said and when. Derek and Patricia separated in November. Lawrence learned about it through a phone call from Patricia late on a Sunday night, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who has been holding something up for a long time and finally set it down. "I didn't know about Section 12, she said. "I want you to know that." "I believe you," he said, and he did, mostly. He believed that she hadn't known the full extent of it. He was less certain that she hadn't known the direction of it, the general shape of what Derek had been building, and had chosen not to look too closely. But that was a different conversation for a different time, and she was his daughter, and some things you work through rather than around. "I'm sorry, Dad." "I know," he said. He meant that too. The restructuring of Harlan Financial Group happened eventually, just not the way Derek had drawn it up. Lawrence worked with Colette and a new CFO to design a transition that actually did what he'd always said he wanted, a gradual handover of operational responsibility, with real oversight built in, to people who had earned it. He promoted 2 regional directors who'd been with the company for over a decade. He created a board review process that he should have had in place years ago. He slowed down, genuinely this time. He stopped coming in on Fridays. He started having lunch outside instead of at his desk. And 6 months after that Tuesday in September, he called Derek's sister, Nadia's mother, a woman named Rosalind who worked as a school librarian on the north side of the city, and he asked if he could speak with her about her daughter. Rosalind was cautious at first, understandably. The situation with Derek had frayed things in that direction too, and Lawrence understood why she might not be sure what to make of a call from the man her brother had tried to defraud. "I'm not calling about Derek," Lawrence said. "I'm calling about Nadia." He explained what he had in mind. Rosalind listened. When he finished, there was a pause. "She did mention you," Rosalind said. "She said you were the man who actually listened." Lawrence didn't answer right away. "She's right that I listened," he said finally. "I want to make sure she knows it mattered." What Lawrence set up was not a grand gesture. He didn't write a check for an amount designed to impress anyone. He worked with Colette to establish a modest educational trust in Nadia's name. Enough to cover college or trade school or whatever she decided she wanted to do with her life when she got old enough to decide. He asked Rosalind to explain it to Nadia in whatever way made sense for an 8-year-old. Rosalind told him later that Nadia had listened to the explanation carefully, asked 2 questions. One about whether the money was definitely real, and one about whether she could use it to go to veterinary school, and then said, "That's very reasonable, Mr. Harlan," which was apparently a high compliment from Nadia. Lawrence laughed when he heard that. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine. He kept the photograph from that day eventually. Not a photograph of the meeting, nothing so formal. A photograph that Rosalind had taken a few weeks later when she brought Nadia by the office at Lawrence's invitation, so he could show her the harbor view he'd always loved. In the photograph, Nadia is standing at the window in her school uniform with her nose about 2 inches from the glass, looking at the water below, and Lawrence is standing beside her. And they are both looking out at the same thing. He put it on his desk. He kept it there. Some people, when they heard the story later, and people did hear it, the way these things get around in a city where everyone knows everyone in the business community, Some people said Lawrence had been lucky. Lucky that Derek's sisters had a scheduling conflict that morning. Lucky that Nadia had been awake in the back seat instead of asleep. Lucky that she was the kind of child who said things out loud instead of keeping them to herself. Lawrence never used the word lucky, he said. There are people in every room who are watching more carefully than you think. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is make sure that when they speak, you stop and actually listen. He said it meant something that a child of 8 had been willing to risk her uncle's anger to tell an old man the truth. And it meant something that the old man had been willing in that moment to hear it. He said he hoped he'd learned at 63 to be the kind of person worth that risk.